Hi everyone. Today we are going to be talking about the Gallipoli campaign that took place in 1915 in World War I. Now, the Gallipoli campaign is one of the attempts of the Entente powers to open up a front outside of Europe. As we've spoken about previously, the Western Front in the First World War was largely this unmoving series of trench works that ran from the Alps in the south all the way to the North Sea in the north. And various attempts by both the Entente powers and the Central Powers were unable to move that line any significant amount of distance, usually through horrendous loss of human life. Now, with the failure of the Entente powers to make any headway on the Western Front whatsoever, commanders began looking for opportunities beyond Europe, ways that they could effectively attack Germany and attack the Central Powers that weren't going through this heavily fortified series of trench works and machine gun nests and artillery emplacements. So the decision was made to attack the Ottoman Empire at Gallipoli. Now, Gallipoli is a peninsula that lies on a body of water known as the Dardanelles. The Dardanelles is a strait that connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Black Sea. The Dardanelles are strategically important because the Ottoman Empire, across this body of water, would be transporting supplies of oil from the Middle East through southeastern Europe to Austria, Hungary, and Germany. So it was a really important part of the Central Powers supply chain. It was also important because if the Entente powers could take the Dardanelles, it would open up a supply line for them, where the British and the French could get supplies from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea and therefore could supply Russia, which would then hopefully allow Russia to make some headway in the east. Now, the architect of the Gallipoli campaign is this man, someone you have probably never heard of before, and that is the First Lord Admiral Winston Churchill. Now, in Churchill's memoirs, he's actually going to downplay the role that he played in the Gallipoli campaign, which is a little bit of foreshadowing about how this whole campaign is going to wind up playing out in the long run. So initially, the Gallipoli campaign was going to be just solely a naval campaign. The British were going to use their superior naval power to eventually force their way through the Dardanelles, force their way through the straits. So Winston Churchill, he initially puts together this large collection of warships, many of which are obsolete designs. So some of these warships, and keep in mind, obsolete, we're talking about, ships from like the early 1900s. So some of them are 10, 15, maybe 20 years old at this point. That's what we're talking about with obsolete here. So he wants to send in this large number of obsolete ships because it's going to be difficult to force the Dardanelles to force the Straits, and ships are going to get lost. And so if you're going to lose ships, you might as well lose the ones that are already unable to fight on equal footing with the German high seas fleet. You're not really weakening your overall naval power too greatly by losing these ships. Now, what Winston Churchill didn't account for is that the captains of these ships were very strongly attached to them. There was a lot of sentiment here because these ships were seen as holdovers from like the old era of warships. Many of them were considered like works of art. They had like these hardwood floors, mahogany furniture in them, these gilded rails and everything. It was kind of like the last class of the old design of British naval vessels. And so these captains didn't really want to lose these ships. So the naval actions start in February of 1915. And initially, what was going to happen is that the British ships, supported by some French ships, were going to open fire on the coastline of Gallipoli to try to get rid of the Ottoman artillery emplacements there, while British minesweeping ships went through the Dardanelles and removed all of the undersea mines. This would then allow the British ships to move into the Narrows themselves and use their guns to open fire on either side of the straits. Now, the big problem with this, and I should say big problems. Number one, poor weather. In February and March, it was very rainy, it was foggy, it was cloudy, and so line of sight was not very good for a lot of this part of the world. So the British were relying on seaplane reconnaissance to aim their shots. The second big problem is that the minesweepers were crewed by civilians. And as you can probably imagine, civilians don't like to operate under heavy artillery fire. So when the civilian minesweeper ships are going through the straits and the Ottoman artillery is opening fire on them, the minesweepers, as soon as they start taking damage and taking losses, they get right out of there. So the decision is then made. We need the warships to move in quicker than anticipated, further than anticipated, in order to really clear the shorelines of these artillery batteries. This actually leads to the loss of 2 British ships, 2, ironically enough, Invincible class British ships, one of which you can see here on the screen. After the loss of these vessels, you start to see the naval captains acting in a much more timid manner, and they refuse to go any further. They pull their ships back to safe distances. It's at this point the decision is made that the Gallipoli campaign is going to transition from a naval battle to an amphibious assault. And it's going to take the British at this point an additional 4 to 6 weeks to plan out how this amphibious assault is going to take place. Now, on the British side of this, you're going to have roughly 500,000 soldiers that are going to take part in the Battle of Gallipoli. The majority of those are going to be British soldiers. You're going to have about 75,000 French soldiers that are going to fight as well, and then another 65,000 Anzac soldiers. And that is the Australia-New Zealand Army Corps. They are fighting for the British Empire, but they are fighting under the flags of Australia and New Zealand, which is actually going to be very important when we talk about the end result of this battle. Now, in the 4 to 6 weeks that it takes the British to come up with their plans for this amphibious assault, the Ottomans have plenty of time to prepare. They know exactly what is going to be occurring. So the Ottomans bolster their forces, they bring in additional troops, they bring in additional artillery batteries, they build their machine gun nests, and they really fortify themselves heavily in Gallipoli. Now, the geography of Gallipoli really plays into the Ottoman side of this. The Ottomans are going to have a big advantage. What you see in front of you right now is the Sphinx. The Sphinx is one of the most distinctive physical features in the area where the Anzac forces are going to be landing, what's going to be known as Anzac Beach. And I want you to imagine, that you are an Anzac soldier, and you are landing on the beach, which of course is going to be like way down here. And you need to get up these heights to ultimately get artillery batteries that are all the way up at the top here. We've talked about the stalemate on the Western Front of World War I, and the Western Front didn't have too many elevation changes to this degree. So you are now dealing with a lot of the same defensive technologies, right? Barbed wire, trenches, machine gun nests, artillery batteries. But you're dealing with them while you are charging up this rough, rocky slope of land. So you may think to yourself, why did the British do this? Why did they attempt this? Doesn't this seem like a bad idea? The short answer here is that the British had very poor intelligence on the geography of Gallipoli. And so the British and their maps were very, very outdated, incomplete. In fact, the British were relying on information from Egyptian tour guides. The British didn't know the terrain was going to be this difficult. So this is a map showing the Anzac Cove, where the Australian-New Zealand Army Corps forces are going to land. One thing I want to point out is what we just looked at, the Sphinx. You can see that located right here on the map. And again, what you can see is that this is really a struggle for these soldiers to get up into these heights to make any type of movement over this rough terrain. Here is an artist's depiction of the landing of the Australia-New Zealand Army Corps soldiers and their attempt to charge up this terrain. You can see this is done under heavy, heavy fire from the Ottomans. Here's another depiction, and once again, you can see the Sphinx located right here in the background, and this gives you a great idea of how difficult the terrain was. Now, keep in mind the Gallipoli campaign lasted 8 months. It was characterized by these soldiers making very slow headway getting up this terrain, attempting to take the artillery batteries at the top. And then once a lot of these artillery batteries were taken by British, Australian, New Zealand Army Corps soldiers, the Ottomans brought in reinforcements and took them right back, pushing the Anzac troops and the British troops back down the slope. So you do have this back and forth that is taking place. And soon you start to see Gallipoli taking on the same characteristics as the Western Front, with very well fortified positions, this huge loss of life, and very little material gain. This is one of the last attempts to get up the heights by the Australian-New Zealand Army Corps before the withdrawal of the British forces in August of 1915. So the decision is ultimately made to abandon the Gallipoli campaign. And this is largely because the British failed to remove the Ottomans from their commanding battlefield presence. The British just simply could not get the Ottomans off of these heights, could not disable their artillery batteries, and the loss of man and loss of resources was just simply getting to be too high. And as the British public was learning about the ongoing failure that was the Gallipoli campaign, the British public started to turn against this particular campaign. So the aftermath of Gallipoli. This is actually pretty significant in many regards, and I'm going to start by talking about why this is significant for the Ottomans. For the Ottomans, this is what most would consider to be a victory. The Ottomans defended Gallipoli, they defended the Dardanelles, they defended this supply line, and the Ottomans, if you recall, were not having a very good previous century. They had suffered a number of military losses, the most recent of which was in the Balkan Wars, where they had been beaten by Greece and Serbia and Bulgaria. And so this was big. This was a big deal for the Ottomans, showing that they could still fight. In fact, one of the heroes of Gallipoli on the Ottoman side was Mustafa Kemal. Mustafa Kemal will go on to be the first president of the Republic of Turkey after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The second big effect here is the development of Australian and New Zealand national consciousness. And so the Australian and New Zealand soldiers and the way they command themselves at this battle, this goes on to become kind of the national characteristic, the national stereotype of the Australians and the New Zealanders. This idea of a stoic, rugged individual who is willing to take on these extremely dangerous propositions, who's willing to put their life on the line in kind of these daring maneuvers, is going on to kind of like be the stereotype of the Australians. Like if you think about how you would characterize Australians today, right? Risk takers, right? This idea of like they don't they seemingly don't give a lot of regard to injury. And again, that is part of this holdover, this consciousness from Gallipoli. Now in Britain, pretty significant effects as well. First off, Winston Churchill, he is demoted from First Lord Admiral. And actually, Winston Churchill in November of 1915 is going to resign from the Admiralty due to the heat that he gets for this campaign. And he's going to spend the remainder of the war commanding soldiers on the Western Front rather than being the Lord of the Navy. Secondly, Prime Minister Asquith is forced to, well, he's forced out of power, essentially, and his position is taken over by David Lloyd George, again, because the public has turned so heavily against the government that was in charge of planning and implementing this. And let's make no mistake here, historians can be somewhat divided over Gallipoli. You're going to see some historians who are going to say that this was a stalemate. They're going to say that yes, the British failed in their objective to open up the Dardanelles to remove the Ottomans. However, the British were successful in causing the Ottomans to divert a lot of manpower and resources and attention to Gallipoli, which took their eye off of things that were happening in the Middle East, the Arab Revolution that was taking place with the assistance of British agents like T.E. Lawrence. It's a very rosy picture, I would say. I would say this was disastrous for the British. The British had poor logistics, poor planning, poor intelligence, undersupplied soldiers. They didn't commit a significant enough amount of naval power to this, and they kept grinding away at it despite all of these flaws and all of these disadvantages. And the public, this is what they were reading about in the newspaper. And this is going to be one example of a much larger trend that we are about to see shaping up in the post-World War, and that is civilian dissatisfaction with their government. And every single belligerent nation is going to have this same type of scenario where the people will lose faith in their government and will believe that their government is no longer qualified to prosecute this war. Of course, the biggest example of this is going to be Russia in 1917, where they are going to lose faith so heavily with their government that they're going to tear down their entire system of government. And so Gallipoli is important as an example of that larger trend, as well as exemplifying the main characteristics that we know, which is an extremely heavy loss of human life for almost no material gain whatsoever. So hopefully that was helpful in understanding Gallipoli and understanding the massive contribution of soldiers, of naval vessels, of artillery, to try to take the Dardanelles. Ultimately, it was a failure, and again is part of this larger characteristic of World War I, which are these battles that have extensive preparation, extensive planning, a huge commitment of material resources, and a huge commitment of manpower for ultimately no gain, a stalemate in the end. So this is another kind of nail in the coffin of civilian confidence in their government and civilian enthusiasm for the war effort. So thank you once again for watching, and I will talk to you all